Okay. All right. Hi there. My name is Jessica Crow, and I am the founder of Apogy. And Apogy provides change management training, coaching, and consulting. And this is our Change Leader Speaker Series. And I'm so pleased to be welcoming Jim Morgan to the show, as I like to call it. It's our video interview, video conversation. Jim has a ton of experience in change management and agile. I'll let him introduce himself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're currently doing, and then I've got some questions for you. We'll just sort of jump right into the conversation. So Jim, let people who are watching this video know who you are and what your background is.
Sure. So most people would think of what I do as just being an agile coach, but I seem to be a fairly unique agile coach because I came along a path that most have not. I started out 25 years ago, that's before the Agile Manifesto was even written, creating what were called self-directed work teams, and still are called that. These are teams that have no manager involved in their daily activities. So I created 4 of these teams. Initially, they had to work together to pull off a massive project. There was no deadline on this project. They just needed to get it done and get it done well. And the results were phenomenal.
All right.
Just blew me out of the water. And so I realized that these things, which had been around for decades, were a very powerful way to get groups to achieve fascinating results. And began creating more of these teams, then started doing research. My very first brief career, was as a science journalist. And so I used those skills to start going through the science behind teamwork. And in doing so, I created a training program, began training managers and teams on how to leverage that science to perform better. But I didn't really feel like doing it on my own, so I kind of turned that into a side business. Meanwhile, I went up through from technical communications into project management, and in 2008, got introduced to this weird thing called Agile. And with a little bit of research, quickly realized that this was a much better fit with both the teamwork science and the realities of project management as I was seeing them as a PMP, a project management professional. So I began shifting my career in that direction, eventually worked my way up to doing agile transformations at very large corporations, and frankly hated it.
Were you on the software development side, or was it agile project management? Any type of project, or was it mostly tech-based?
It was mostly tech-based. Now, I like to point out that those first teams, agile teams I was creating before the manifesto, were equipment managers. So no application to software whatsoever. I've applied it in a very wide range. The last corporation I was doing it at, I was working with, yes, software developers, but also firmware developers and hardware design developers who were actually designing the hardware equipment that all the other stuff went into or supported. So one of the big myths that I often fight about agility is this idea that it was invented in software.
Right.
Well, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So anyway, so now, and for leaving that last corporation, I just decided I don't want to continually fight against people who are not going to change their minds.
Right.
Instead, I am now focusing on trying to pick up particularly startup founders and maybe small business owners who I can talk to directly and shift their thinking into using the broad package of progressive management techniques that are currently referred to as agile management.
Got it. So 2 questions for you then. One is, what were some of the, you said people wouldn't change their minds. What were some of the big pushbacks that you were experiencing as you were trying to implement agile thinking and process for the organizations that you were supporting? And then the second question is, what is how has this been translated into your experience with change management? So you've got your background in PMP, you've been training and coaching, and I'm assuming, project management and change management for many are closely linked. That's sort of, a lot of training organizations focus on that connection. I think my perspective is it's much broader than that, and it does not necessarily have to be tied to a project.
I think they're two different things entirely.
Yeah. So sorry, I kind of started talking while right after I asked you a question, but
I'll follow you anywhere, Jessica. It's all right.
Right on. Well, so what were some of the major pushbacks that you experienced or what you were hearing at the time that created that desire for you to work directly, kind of get in at the early stages, startup entrepreneur? That makes a lot of sense to me. And then the connection to change management.
One of the big myths in the management world is that personality is the primary driver of behavior in any given situation. We've got many decades of research showing that environment and situation have a much stronger impact. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is once you're in a large multi-level hierarchy that has been built for 20, 50 years, following a particular set of practices around setting deadlines and hitting them no matter what.
Right.
Getting people to break out of that is extremely difficult because it's embedded in the environment.
Right.
So you have to be able to change the entire organizational culture, and in some cases, the physical infrastructure in order to break out of that kind of thinking. If it's a public organization, then you might have to change. Yeah, it's even harder. And if it's a corporation with shareholders, you've got to change the relationship to shareholders and analysts. I mean, I could go down that path for a long time. So the pushback is around, focus on quality, customer satisfaction, don't worry about deadlines, but when are you going to deliver it?
Right.
Constantly getting that because, and I don't want to sound like I'm blaming those executives. Like I said, that's the environment that they gain social power in. That's how they know to maintain that social power. And that's what the environment, the organization is built on. So that's why I shifted my thinking to trying to catch organizations before they have built that environment. Get them to build the environment such that it is supportive of decentralization and self-directed work teams and full transparency, et cetera, rather than trying to change an environment that quite frankly just isn't going to. The reason there's a book like Good to Great from so many years ago is because so many companies don't go from good to great. So from the change management side, more specifically, I agree with you. Change management is sort of the what you have to do. Project management is more around how you do any kind of project, including change management projects. Yes, change management can also inform and be a part of projects, but it is still a very separate discipline to me.
Right.
So where this fits in is you have got to address the psychology from a perspective of not just the individuals, but the scenario and the environment, or you're simply not going to succeed.
Right. Yeah, no. And so one thing, as you were talking too, I think kind of going back to the difficulty of changing the environment, is there's a lot of expectations, especially for public organizations that have shareholders that are expecting a return or, there's a lot of pressure there. So whether or not it's the individuals that are contributing to the dynamics, which it typically does happen that way. There's just, I think the way that businesses are structured, creating that change, that shift that you're talking about is even more challenging because of all the pressure that you're getting from external factors. But related to change management within the organization, yes, I agree it's a separate discipline. At the same time, I also think though, that change management, sorry if you can hear my cat meowing, apologies everyone, that's my loud 18-year-old cat who's completely deaf. And
that's right. I have a ferret tugging at my pants legs wanting to climb up. So we're
oh my gosh, I love it. That's really funny. Pets. But change management, I think one of the things, and my next question for you is around where is change management headed? Because I think the classic way of thinking about and approaching change management being tied to project management, also being tied to structures based on, hierarchies, that top-down approach. What I'm seeing with clients, and maybe you're seeing this even in the startup entrepreneurial space, is the past couple of years, thanks to the pandemic, has really changed the internal business model, the structures within the organization, sort of flattening out those structures that were influential in implementing change because you had somebody telling you, here's what you have to do. And, oh, by the way, when is it done? Don't worry about deadlines, but when is it done? And now you've got people working remotely, you've got people in hybrid situation. And so that title still, I think, carries some weight, but not, I think that's the tide is turning there. So as I think about change management and project management and the way that things happen in an organization, combined with all the external pressures that are still there, but a very different environment, how do you think, if you could wave a magic wand, what would be your sort of ideal scenario for, change management, agile project management? How, if somebody was to step into a role as a change professional today, what would best support them in terms of skills, in terms of their thinking? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first and the biggie is that according to criteria from the Project Management Institute, change management projects should never be run in a classic waterfall methodology.
Interesting. Okay.
There are far too many unknowns. You don't know what kind of resistance you're going to come up with until you've done an organizational readiness assessment. There are all kinds of things that could crop up. You don't know how much resources are going to be applied to this, how much of a priority is going to be applied to this. You don't know how good your project sponsor is going to be. I mean, I can go on forever, but all of those unknowns added up mean that it is literally impossible to predict the scope, schedule, and cost of a change management project. So what the agility world says is, don't waste time and money creating plans that will not be met. So for change management, I use in fact, a talk I gave a couple of months back for the Carolinas chapter talked about my approach that is fully agile. And what this means is we take all the work that needs to be done in a large scale organizational culture change. You may not need to do all these in smaller change efforts, but some part of them will be. You take all those things, you list them in what the agile world would call a backlog, which is just the list of everything we know right now we need to do. Then you pick the one or two things that you really absolutely positively need to do over the next few weeks to move down that list, and you just do those. And then you come back at the end of that 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month at most. You show it to the change sponsor. You hopefully show it to some people who are interested in the change, supportive of the change, what I refer to as change agents, not any a formal title, but just people who are interested. And you get feedback on what you did in the past month. And they say, we like that, we don't like that. And now we see that gives us an idea.
So you're talking about sprints, like getting feedback on the work that's produced in sprints.
That's the Scrum word, but the concept of an incremental development has been that phrase has been used for more than 50 years,
right?
Long before the sprint word came along. But yes, in the Scrum world, that is called a sprint. The point is that you only plan that much work. Then you get feedback. You inspect and adapt, you make sure you've done everything at the top quality, and you decide, okay, what do we need to focus on in the next iteration?
Got it.
And you just do that, and you just keep working your way down until your objectives show that the changes have been accomplished.
So if I'm in a change management role, so I actually when I was trained in change management more than a decade ago, it was to support a software implementation, and the approach we used was waterfall. So it ended up working though, because they were developing the software as we were getting ready to launch it. So we had lots of opportunities to pilot some of the early features. It was definitely not agile, but we had a test environment. And so we would test, and then we'd fix, and then we'd add, the stuff that was okay to the bigger things that we would scale. We had to do it waterfall because of all the integration that was required.
Oh, I'm going to
eventually,
challenge you. You know, I'm going to
well,
challenge you on that
I know.
statement.
Well, we
Go
tried to
ahead.
do agile, but then it ended up being like a hybrid of agile and waterfall, and it never really made it to agile. And then we got a, the systems, you were integrating so many different systems that were kind of archaic, and our architecture was also, wasn't as, I think, modern as maybe it is at the organization now. The company did go into agile, but it was more for mobile apps. They found that to be more of a sweet spot versus the big systems. Anyways, the change management in a waterfall setting or in an agile setting, what you're describing to me is, if I'm a change management professional, then my role is to connect with the teams that are creating those small incremental changes, and then the end users who will be affected by the change, and bridge those gaps. So my role as a change leader, change management professional, whatever you want to call it, is to provide that coordination, facilitation, be looking at the impacts, working on training if needed. Like, how would you describe the change management professional's role in that context?
Yeah, so I have an informal role within my approach to agility in a larger scale cross team program that I call the Agile Liaison. And what this is this is someone who is representing a particular function of the company that is directly impacted by this project.
Got it.
They're going to participate in inserting user stories into the project for stuff that needs to be done by those teams in order to accomplish whatever that discipline needs. So in the case of change management, that means you're going to be doing all the things you just described, turning them into requirements, which in much of the Agile world are referred to as user stories. Making sure, coordinating with, depending on what framework you're using, if we'll use Scrum. Scrum will have a role called the product owner, who is the person who is supposedly in charge of making sure that those requirements get done. I have arguments with that, but I won't go into that here. But you will be coordinating the product owner to make sure that your requirements are getting into the backlog and prioritized such that they get done in a timely manner for you to be able to do the rest of what you need to do. So in this case, you would be representing the end users. Let's say you're doing a rollout of a new ERP system. You're going to be representing all those end users to make sure that you're getting the information you need from the teams to make sure that the users are being persuaded to buy into the system, and then later on for the training, for the coaching and how to use the system. And you would participate, you wouldn't be in all of the activities, but generally in my approach, you would be in the demonstration ceremony at the end of each iteration, which is where you can provide input, because there's any number of things that those teams might be doing that might be impacting the change management process and or the end users that they're not aware of. So that's part of your job, is to be their representative. Also, that's where you would be making sure that the user stories that you put in are getting done in a timely manner and are being done right.
Right.
Because one of the key emphasis in iterative development is that each iteration is developed at high quality, at the kind of quality that you think you could release now and no bugs would be found. So that's also part of your job.
So what you're describing is somewhat of a hybrid role for the change management professional in the context that you're describing in this agile environment. And I will say I'm on board with adding in different capabilities and skills, because I think that it's sort of needed for our practice and our profession. And I think maybe my background in IT as well has influenced my thinking there, because I have had experience with, making sure the requirements were correct and working with end users, a voice of the customer, being a part of the demo. So I think that is an opportunity for change management professionals because of the focus on people, on the end users, and the role that they can play. I've also, and would love to hear your thoughts on this, being able to surface and shape demand for additional, for future innovation. I think because of where they sit within that process, because they're working directly with end users and the team that's responsible for designing and developing whatever the change is, whether it's tech or something else, they have that, it's almost like you've got this perspective, you know what the business or the team has the capabilities of doing, and then you've got this demand coming from the end users, and how do you help navigate that on behalf of both teams, I'll say both business units, to make sure that you're not promising something that isn't possible, and vice versa, you're not, developing things that the end users don't actually want.
Right.
So
Well,
what are your thoughts on that?
You shouldn't have to, but if it's not being done, please do.
Right.
So what I mean by that is let's go back to the startup world for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
One of the key things that startups have been taught to do, but most of them still don't do right, is something called customer discovery.
Mm-hmm.
This is the process of going out and listening to customers,
Mm-hmm.
to potential customers. And I'm emphasizing that because most people think, oh, I'm going to go meet with a potential customer, I'm going to tell them all about my great new app.
They have a field of dreams mentality. If they build it, people will come. Yeah.
Hey, my mom and dad said this is great, so I'm just going to go out and do this. Customer discovery is taking a set of questions and going out and asking those questions, but also following the person wherever they might lead if they go off topic a little bit, to learn what the customer's needs are,
Mm-hmm.
what the customer's wants are, and not filtered by what I would like to do, going back to a point you just made, but filtered by what the customer will actually pay for.
Mm-hmm.
Or within an internal situation, what the customer actually wants to use. And in this case, I'm considering the customer to be the end user.
Mm-hmm.
So that should be a similar process should be getting done on a regular basis by any team that claims to be agile.
Mm-hmm.
They should be in direct contact with end users, getting feedback by some mechanism. So the primary job of the product owner should be going out and finding out what the customers actually want and need, and translating that into user stories for the teams to consume and work on. Hopefully some of those people are sitting in some of those demonstration ceremonies that I talked about,
Mm-hmm.
where they're actually able to give direct input on what they're seeing in front of them. But if that is not happening, I agree with you. The change manager needs to step in and provide additional support to the product owner,
Mm-hmm.
or whoever that role is, depending on the framework is, to make sure that end users are staying top of mind. Because what the Agile Manifesto captured very clearly is something that had been emphasized by management gurus going back literally. I just finished blogging about a book written in 1947 that emphasized that customer wants and needs should be primary, customer satisfaction should be primary, and that includes extremely high quality.
Mm-hmm.
That is where a change manager can certainly play a big role if they see that that's not happening. Because if you don't do that, your job as a change manager is going to get a lot harder.
Right. So the concept of agile change management, and there's a lot of talk in the change management world about, let's do agile change management. This is agile change management. And your expertise in agile and change management, for me, it's like a buzzword in some ways, saying agile change management, because there's a process for change management. There's a process for agile. And so what are your thoughts on that? I don't know. I'm still wrapping my head around how this is different than, like, how is agile change management different than change management? Because you could really plug change management into any environment or context. Even if PMP says don't do waterfall, I've definitely done change management in a waterfall setting. But what you're saying is, there should be a product owner. If there isn't, then you plug a change management professional in. So that's why I'm like, a change professional should understand how to adapt their approach regardless of the process and structure that exists within the organization. So what are your thoughts on agile change management? Is it a thing? Is it like a new thing with its own distinct process, or is it something else?
So we need to be really careful with the word process.
Uh-huh.
There is no such thing as an agile process.
Well, okay. Tell me. So give me your thoughts on that.
Agile is simply a set of principles.
Okay.
Those principles, again, date back many, many decades before the Agile Manifesto.
Right.
The Agile Manifesto, let's be more clear, the Manifesto for Agile Software Development merely encapsulated those really clearly. And
got it. Yeah.
what I've been teaching for a long time is, if you think about it that way, then you can take that word software, strike it out, replace it with whatever you do.
Right.
Those principles are going to be perfectly applicable.
Right.
Because they did not come out of the software world. The word agile was borrowed from a book about agile management written in 1994, which right. is 7 years before the manifesto was written. Yeah. So it's been around for a very long time. What I would argue is that, well, there was an article in 1970 from one of the earliest computer scientists who was also a practitioner, saying that what we today refer to as waterfall is highly prone to failure in software development projects.
It is.
And he showed instead an iterative development model that today we would say, hey, that looks exactly like Scrum. My point being that software development should never have been using a waterfall approach. We were warned about this 50 years before the manifesto was written.
Right.
So, 30 years before the manifesto was written. So I would argue the same thing about agile change management. There are, throughout the word process, there are steps that if you do them, tasks, if you will, that if you do them, you are far more likely to achieve the goals of the change manager process or project than if you don't do them. And my approach has all those critical success factors, because my approach is based on my research into the standard organizational culture change literature. All I did was two things. I reformatted them into an agile friendly approach, and then I talked about how to do them in an agile manner. So I would argue that change management should never have been using a waterfall approach, simply from the standpoint of it wastes time and money doing planning that is never going to be true, because there are simply too many unknowns. I'll also point out that in both the software and change management worlds, the vast majority of these being done in companies that have been doing waterfall project management for 30 years, and they're not going to change. Your earlier example where they started to do agile, but they ended up being hybrid and not really being agile, is exactly the problem. And it goes back to my very earliest comments that the structure of the organization means that if you're going to really truly change to these progressive management techniques that today we call agile, you're going to be looking at a 10-year program. In order to change the whole thing. That's kind of what the book I mentioned earlier, Good to Great, very well-known management guru books I've talked about, lists a number of such programs that were 20-year efforts in order to make that change. So I'm trying to differentiate between what would work, what would be the most efficient and effective way of doing change management or software development, or frankly, just about any kind of work that isn't highly repetitive.
Right.
And there's even agile approaches to doing highly repetitive work too. So I think agility can apply to almost everything within any company. I also think that the vast majority of companies will never get there, or it'll be a very long time. So to your point, a change manager is going to have to be able to live in the waterfall world, even though it probably isn't the best world for the most efficient and effective approaches to change management. But if you are in an environment where you are given a certain degree of control, then I strongly recommend going with the more agile method. You'll save yourself a lot of time, effort, and headaches.
Right. Well, I think the key word here is agility. I think maybe that's where change management professionals should lean in, regardless of the environment being agile, waterfall. And if there's no project, tech project involved, it's not project management, I'm seeing a lot of integration between change management and talent development on the HR side, and creating these networks of expertise and excellence. And so I think really where my how I'm thinking about it is what organizations want is agility, period. And how that happens depends on the structure of the environment and the way that things, are set up, making that transition to being a more agile environment. So maybe that's the little a versus like the big
exactly.
A. That is a culture change in many ways too. And yes, the way that systems are structured and set up and how they support the people doing the work matters. But I think, just to agile big A change management to me is not really a thing. It's more about developing resilient, agile organizations and the ability for them to be able to respond to disruption, to be able to pivot quickly, to be able to implement things within the organization based on business strategy, and having change management, people who are trained in change management understand how to shape the decision making and having an impact at the outset. So any changes that are determined, that end users are more responsive to those changes because they know what to expect, because they had buy-in, they had a say in what they were, and then the rest of the process happens more smoothly and everything happens more with greater agility because of that. So I think there's still, a lot of opportunity to continue to explore this space, but I agree. I think most organizations are not structured agile. Maybe that's the big A.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. There's a reason that my company name emphasizes the lowercase a, because yes, I can come in and teach you how to do Scrum and Kanban and how to run programs along those lines. But what I would really prefer to do is come in and teach you how to completely decentralize all that, set some performance standards that everybody needs to meet, and then provide coaching to help those teams figure out how they're going to meet those standards. Allow each team to create its own approach in order to do that, in order to fit into those standards, and only have as much cross-program processes and structure as absolutely necessary. So only the bare minimum absolutely necessary to make sure that you're coordinating and not bumping up against each other.
Right.
But yeah, so I like that distinction, and I agree. Well, so there's consultants and consulting firms and staffing agencies that are going to try to tell you that there is such a thing as capital A change management.
Right.
And I'm going to say that they're just trying to make money off of you.
Right.
I think anyone who's in the change management world is inherently agile, because you have to be in order to deal with change.
Yep, that's my thesis too.
I think I'm not big on personality testing for reasons I touched on a little bit earlier, but in the sense of openness to change, I suspect that assessments would show that most change managers are very highly score very high on that particular trait. So it is not a matter so much of the change manager being agile. It is a matter of the change manager figuring out how to increase the agility of the rest of the organization.
Right.
And this is one of the things I again want to go back to point out is, even though everyone's focused on the changes coming out of the COVID pandemic, I'm sorry, I've been hearing this clarion call for dealing with change forever. The blog post I mentioned earlier, I talk about how a very large corporation shifted from making 250 products to 3,000 completely different products within a very short period of time because of massive environmental change. And the ways they did this were some of the things we have already talked about: decentralization, allowing greater local control, high degrees of transparency, high degree of what today we would refer to as agility. That book, that the company was General Motors in 1947, and the book was in 1947, talking about the environmental change of World War II. Right. Skip forward to, I'm reading a book by Tom Peters right now that was written in 1987, that with a few minor wording changes and some changes of examples would be entirely applicable to today's world. So these are long-standing issues that the change manager is just going to have to be able to adapt to, because you're not going to be able to change most of them.
Right. It's the adaptation piece that's huge. Just being able to flex with the environment and do the best you can with what you can.
Yeah,
Frankly.
precisely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, interesting. What, okay, let's pivot. I have a different question for you now.
Sure.
What role, because I was again looking on your website, and it appears that you do some leadership coaching as well. And that is something that I also emphasize in my training and coaching, is that you can know all these things about everything that we've talked about, but being an effective leader is something different than having that knowledge of the process and the whatever it is we just described, right? Like agile and scrum and project management and change management. So what's your take on the role and the importance of developing your leadership skills alongside your knowledge and competency from a technical perspective?
Change management is all psychology.
Right.
Every bit of it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you just described, the processes, the techniques, et cetera, are merely supporting getting people to change their attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
I went to something you pointed out or started to touch on. You gave me a big smile because I just remembered an incident where someone came up to me afterwards. I'd been talking about how management guru books have basically been repeating the same stuff for many, many decades because leaders don't actually do them.
Right. Right.
So really go, oh, that sounds great. I should do that. And then it goes on the shelf. And this one gentleman came up to me after a talk I gave where I'd mentioned that. And he said, yeah, the absolute worst manager I ever had bookshelves filled with management books.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the real question is getting human beings to change what they think and therefore what they do.
And they feel, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and so when I say think, I'm including feelings as one of the factors that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Okay.
So my master's thesis was on persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's very clear is that thoughts and feelings are so highly interconnected that you really can't pull them apart.
Right.
You're going to think things, it's going to create feelings. Those feelings are going to
drive your actions and behaviors.
And both will drive your actions and behaviors. Exactly. There's this huge misunderstanding that personality is just your tendencies, but what it is tendencies of action as well as of thought. Mm-hmm. So to bring this back around, what you've got is you're going to have a set of people who are going to resist just about any change simply because they like things the way they are now.
Right.
And even if they think that this change is beneficial, they don't want to go through the hassle. They're okay the way they are now. It's good.
Yeah.
You're going to have people on the opposite side who are going to want to pick up every latest thing that they read about, or see an Instagram post about. They're going to say, hey, we should go do this now. So you've got this very broad spectrum. And of course, you've got people all the way in between. What you have to identify is the basic values that are going to be applicable to the broadest range of people, and then figure out how to get those people to, within that set of core values they have, to recognize the value of the change enough that they will actually change their behaviors. Yeah. That is a massive conundrum.
Yeah, no, and I'm really glad you actually brought that up. I had a conversation, a talk with, I have a friend who's a social media influencer. So we did a collaboration where she, I think social media is a great example of people leading, air quotes, because they're not really leading, but they're leveraging their influence, and it's inspiring, influencing people to go buy products or to do something that's aligned with whatever that person is doing. I think in the organization, that same dynamic exists, but you have that power and authority component as well in some cases. So we were talking about, how do you identify in an organization those individuals who have the core values, the shared values? I think values is such a big piece of this. So when you're thinking about sponsors and change champions or influencers, or however you think about them, you have to really hone in on the values. And then how do they, use their storytelling, use a social media almost approach to influence and inspire people that have the same sort of values in the organization to think differently about the changes that are happening. And so we had a whole conversation on it. And I love that your head's in the same spot about this, because it is really tough. And even if you have an organization with mission, vision, values, that's meant to drive some sort of cohesion, but an organization is made of complex people with very personal values and beliefs. And that's why this whole, how do you affect culture change is hard. How do you affect culture change?
Let's pull a thread right there real quick. That you're not going to be able to change someone's values.
No, right.
So the idea of having top-down values that the leadership team sat around and created is absurd.
It's interesting.
It's absolutely ridiculous. So one of the reasons I like working with smaller companies is that they are still at a stage where they can take all 20 or 40 or 60 people and have them come up together with what that group's values are.
Right.
You were touching on just before I interrupted you.
No, this is good.
So that is going to actually come up with a mission, a system, and values that actually do drive this group. Now, you have to be careful, because if all 20 people are white males like me, you're going to come up with a set of values that, as you expand down the road, is not going to work for people who look like you or people of color, et cetera. So you've got to be able, you've also got to be, you need to be focusing on diversity and inclusion from your very first hire. But the other piece of that is, as your company evolves, you're going to need to keep coming back to those values and that mission and make sure that they still align with the new group of people that you have.
One person that I spoke with as part of the Change Leader Speaker Series had said, agreed with you on the concept of values. And he referred to it as, instead of having values, have a shared purpose, because values are so personal. So it's almost like a different way of saying the same thing, but that purpose may be more inclusive, because then you still honor the distinct values and beliefs of the individuals. So I think it's important to really dissect and have these conversations, because for one, change management is still confusing, even though it's been around. Agile is still confusing, even though these things have been around since the 1940s. We're still trying to figure out what in the heck we're actually talking about. So being able to break it down and have conversations using common terminology, I think will be helpful to people who are watching this video, who are change management professionals, who are leaders in an organization. Hopefully it helps them think about how to have change happen, and have it be, have a good employee experience and get the business results that you want to. So all of this matters. And I'm really grateful that you've shared your wisdom with me. I've learned a lot, and I know the community of people that are connected to Apogy are going to learn from this too. Any final words, any sort of way to wrap up our conversation, that if I am a leader, a change management professional, project manager, whatever role I'm in an organization, how should I be preparing myself for the future, or helping my organization set up structures and process and culture from the get-go? Like, pretend I'm in a startup environment. What would you recommend? Like, the number one thing, like, what should I do? What should I focus on? What do you think?
Empower your employees.
Love it. Love it. One of our guiding principles: empower people to power change. So I love it.
It's all of the, if I had a whiteboard behind me, I could list all of these basic principles that I've been referring to that we now call agile. But every one of them eventually boils down to not controlling people, fully fledged adults.
Right.
Coach them.
Right.
Sometimes this requires a little bit of controlling up front to help them sort of put their structure in place that's going to replace the micromanager. But very, very quickly, you should be rotating around to where the only way that you're a leader is by providing the resources for those people, and then providing coaching from behind. Have you thought about doing this? Try this. you might want to contact this person,
Yeah.
and trust your fully fledged adults
Yes. To do the work.
to do the work, and and most importantly, to please their customers that they're in direct contact with.
Yep. Yep. Oh, I love that. Jim, where can people find you? Where, if somebody wants to learn more about what you do, about your methodology and methods, I know you've got training and coaching and all sorts of stuff that you offer. How can people get in touch with you? What's the best way?
The very simple way is to go through the website, which is fullscaleagile.com.
Cool.
And you can see all the services we provide, but it is also a book on the web. It is basically all of my training knowledge, as best I can, put out there on the web, open source, because I want to try to promulgate these principles. But if you want to get there faster and easier, hire me. So that's where the coaching, you'll find coaching information there, and the contact form.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm really grateful that we had a chance to connect. Like I said, I learned quite a bit from this conversation, and yeah, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
And you as well. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.